Well, the task to which I've been given today concerns a topic where I want to bridge a little bit of systematic theology together with what is a very sensitive historical question. I don't have any slides, so if there's pictures of wine farms in Stellenbosch or Parle, that's fine by me, but I'm very old school. I don't know how to use slides. So I'm going to give you a kind of reception history of Calvin in relation to the Creed, touching a little bit upon the Westminster Assembly, but also theologians during Calvin's time and immediately thereafter. Now, theologians at the Westminster Assembly during those tumultuous years in 1646 were given by Parliament the arduous and sensitive theological task of providing the Church of England with a new confession of faith that touched on all the major points of divinity while trying to establish as much unity among the church as possible. Many will think the confession is elaborate. It actually wasn't intended to be, but something that you could unify as many people as possible on. Now, this attempt to reform the church, as you know, included revising the 39 Articles of the Church of England, which were first written in 1563. Now, the 39 Articles contained several statements that were debated by the Westminster divines. And two of the topics that came under most debate, at least according to the minutes, had reference to the Genevan reformer John Calvin and his own interpretation of various theological truths. Article 8, for example, suggests that the Nicene Creed, the Athanasian Creed, and the Apostles' Creed ought to be thoroughly received and believed, since their teaching agrees with the Scriptures. And that, as you know, found in the 39 Articles, would be very prominent at the Westminster Assembly. Now, this includes the statement found in the Apostles' Creed concerning Christ's descent into hell, the third article, which is a very short, but then it manages to make sure, and he descended into hell. And this became a debate at the Westminster Assembly, and without getting into all the details, we do know that the Westminster divines did not follow John Calvin's own understanding of that phrase. They took a different turn. Less controversial, but potentially ambiguous statements like the Nicene Creed's God of God also proved to be a source of contention among the Westminster divines. And Calvin's own contribution to these 2 points of divinity did not go unnoticed at the Assembly, as the divines sought to understand the relation of Reformation and post-Reformation theology to the major ecumenical creeds. Obviously, I'm going to focus on the concept of Jesus Christ as very God of very God. Now, Calvin, of course, was not present at Westminster, but there is no question that of all the 16th century Reformation theologians, his influence seems to be most keenly felt in terms of the floor debates. And something of his significance in England during this time can be understood by statements made by one of the most highly regarded theologians at the Assembly, Thomas Goodwin. Speaking of Calvin's Institutes of Christian Religion, Goodwin remarks, "Oh, how sweet was the reading of some parts of that book to me. How pleasing was the delivery of truths in a solid manner then to me." And he refers to Calvin as that holy and greatest light of the Reformed churches. Calvin's praise from those who followed him is echoed widely. Turretin in his Institutes will speak about the never to be sufficiently praised reformers. And typically when post-Reformation theologians are dealing with Calvin, even when he wasn't as precise as he could have been, they show great restraint in not criticizing him too sharply and go to great lengths to often defend him, which we will see below. Now, Thomas Norton, he translated Calvin's Institutes into English that went through several printings in England during the 17th century before there were puffs on the back of Crossway books and so on. There was Thomas Norton, who we can blame for the over-exuberant praise that we sometimes find on the back of books. And he said, though many great learned men have written books of commonplaces of our religion, as Melanchthon, whose works are very good and profitable to the Church of God, yet by the consenting judgment of those that understand the same, there is none to be compared to this work of Calvin, both for his substantial sufficiency of doctrine, the sound declaration of truth in articles of our religion, the large and learned confirmation of the same, and the most deep and strong confutation of all old and new heresies, so that the Holy Scriptures accepted, this is one of the most profitable books for all students of Christian divinity. So clearly, Calvin's work was widely read and appreciated by Reformed theologians in the 17th century. Now, in Calvin's particular field that we're going to be looking at today concerning the question of the Trinity and the Son as autotheos, just a few introductory remarks before I get into the real meat and what I would call difficulty of the question. In his 1536 edition, and it's very important to understand that Calvin's teaching on the Trinity basically can't be appreciated unless you understand that his later statements on the Son's aseity come into the 1559 edition, but aren't really found earlier on in the early editions. We'll get to that a little bit later. But there is a bit of a distancing from the Niceno-Constantinopolitan language of ousia and hypostasis. In fact, there's a preference for the wording of the Athanasian Creed in terms of Calvin's exposition of the Trinity. And he will translate, instead of using the Greek words, which he has no problem with in terms of responding to heresy, ousia and hypostasis, he will use substantia, the Latin substantia, and subsistentia, and then he will move to essentia and persona, and that's because he has a Latinate audience. And so Calvin is Western, Augustinian, Latin in the way he expresses the Trinity. He had a tendency to avoid somewhat creedal subscription, and there's an interesting story that I might get to a little bit later on that point. But it may be a surprise to some, Calvin was not a trained theologian. He was not a technical theologian like the post-Reformation Reformed scholastics. Even his Institutes is a pastoral manual for pastors. It isn't meant to be the highest end theology, and when you see those who followed Calvin, they're often more precise, and Calvin will say things that are hard to sometimes wedge together in a consistent manner. He didn't actually have the same type of training. They stood on his shoulders, but he didn't have some of the same training that you might find in a Futsius or a Polanus and those types of theologians. And that will help us to understand a little bit of why this debate on autotheos was so tricky. Now, for the most part, Calvin's public theological career, he was involved in Trinitarian debates with traditionalists like Pierre Caroli, but also heretics, including Michael Servetus. And somewhat remarkably, but consistent for making very few, he didn't, like Augustine, have his retractions. Calvin pretty consistent over his career. During these debates, Calvin's defense of the Son of God's aseity seems to have remained unchanged in the midst of his confrontations with orthodox and heterodox opposition. And one of the fascinating things about studying historical theology is trying to come to grips with how a theologian is dealing not with one opponent usually, but sometimes several opponents. And sometimes opponents from within your own theological tradition, as well as those who would be called heretics or otherwise deeply in error, but nonetheless Christian. And so phrases have to be understood in the context with whom they are speaking to or addressing, and can't just be ripped out of context to be saying something they were never intended to say. Now, with that in mind, the offense of Pierre Caroli towards Calvin, who Caroli was basically orthodox in terms of his theology, he wanted Calvin and Pierre Viret to subscribe to the Nicene and Athanasian creeds to prove their orthodoxy. Now, you think Calvin might say, yes, that's no problem. I subscribe to Nicaea and Athanasian Creed. In fact, the Athanasian Creed seems to have formed how he phrases his Trinitarian doctrine. But Calvin could be a little bit stubborn at times and decides that he's not going to subscribe to these creeds because Pierre Caroli is asking him to do so. That's human nature, is it not? If you just subscribe to this creed, then I will accept that you are Orthodox. And Calvin says, no, I'm not going to subscribe to that creed then. All sorts of shenanigans going on back then, not unlike today. Now, while Calvin certainly had misgivings about Nicene speculation, and I use that word carefully, on eternal generation, it would certainly be an overstatement to say that he rejected the creed itself. Indeed, even his criticism of the Nicene formula, God of God, light of light, very God of very God, is more one of form and not actually of content. And Calvin did, however, argue that the creed's phrase, theos ek theo, God of God, had been consistently misunderstood to mean that the Son derived his divinity from the Father, but in a very specific way. He also believed that the Niceno-Constantinopolitan language of begetting, God of God, light of light, true God of true God, was unnecessarily repetitive. Now, most Reformed theologians didn't agree with that, but these are some of the things Calvin is saying. Now, Calvin's position on the Son's aseity, that is, his self-existence, his fully, shall we say, developed position in the midst of debates, is located in the 1559 edition of the Institutes, particularly Book 1, 13, and then 19 to 25. But it is a final polemical section. And in this section, he provides the rationale for why the Son must be God of himself. A basic premise of his thought concerns the two ways the Trinity must be understood. And this is, I think, extremely important. Firstly, personal identities, including unique, incommunicable characteristics peculiar to each person, are comparative and relational. The distinctness of the three persons arises from the personal properties, paternity, filiation, procession. These distinctives of paternity, filiation, procession add nothing substantially new to the being or essence of God. Second, regarding the divine essence, Calvin employs what we call non-relative language. So as an attribute of God, aseity belongs to the Father, Son, and Spirit equally. Therefore, the Son is not substantially different from the Father, but he is relationally different. Now, at this point, there's nothing to get hot and bothered about by anyone. This is just basic Trinitarian grammar, terminology, beliefs. Now, this twofold way of understanding Trinitarian doctrine is explained by Calvin's quote from Augustine. And it's very basic, and Calvin will prefer, instead of using fancy theological phrases, to simply spell out what he means and does not mean, and avoids some of the phrases that would later be used by theologians, as well as those that had already used those phrases in earlier centuries. He says, Christ with respect to himself is called God. With respect to the Father, he is Son. Again, the Father, with respect to himself, is called God, but with respect to the Son, he is Father. Insofar as he is called Father with respect to the Son, he is not the Son. Insofar as he is called the Son with respect to the Father, he is not the Father. insofar as he is called both Father with respect to himself and Son with respect to himself, he is the same God. Therefore, when we speak simply of the Son without regard to the Father, we may well and properly declare him to be of himself. And for this reason, we call him the sole beginning. That language will get him in a little bit of trouble. But when we mark the relation that he has with the Father, we rightly make the Father the beginning of the Son. So Calvin affirms then the Son's procession from the Father, but some have argued almost in a strictly personal fashion, and this is where the debate hinges. Now, Calvin has this phrase in his institutes that people have seized upon in order to say that Calvin believes in eternal generation, but only in a strictly personal fashion and not the communication of essence. And here's the language that people get excited about. For whoever says that the Son has been given his essence from the Father denies that he has being from himself. So if you say, on a very cursory reading of this quote, that the Father communicates essence to the Son, which actually the majority of the Reformed Orthodox would affirm, you are denying that he has being from himself. Now, how do we read that quote? Do we just take it at face value? Well, this is what got Calvin into a lot of trouble in subsequent decades from his opponents. Calvin's Latin proves useful here. He does not have in view the idea that the Son's nature is communicated. He's not talking about that. He doesn't talk about communicatio, but whether the Father essentiates, essentiatum, the Son's essence, such that the result is two different gods. So if you look at his Latin, he's talking about the Father essentiating an essence to the Son that would then make him somewhat inferior, and that is what he is critiquing. It doesn't mean he's necessarily disagreeing with an orthodox communication of essence. In fact, the terminology that is used is taken right out of Gentilis, Valentin Gentil, book on the subject. And the concern in each statement is with Gentilis' tritheistic conception of the Son's essentiation from the Father, and not the patristic idea of communication of essence by means of eternal generation. And so he's responding to a very specific claim in the final edition of his Institutes, which you don't find remarked upon in the earlier versions. The Latin roughly translated Calvin, just to let you know his colorful language, he said, "The wickedness of Valentin Gentil was uncovered and openly transmitted, who imagines Christ as an essential God." So the point that Calvin is disputing here is a highly polemical situation where he is dealing with a different understanding of communication of essence than what we would typically understand in Reformed Orthodox or classical Trinitarian circles. So by insisting on the Son as autotheos, God of himself, a se ipso, Calvin stressed the equality of the persons in the Godhead in a vigorous attempt to resist even the mildest form of subordinationism. In so doing, he aroused the fierce opposition of theologians from various traditions who were either unwilling to allow Christ a deity in every respect equal to that of the Father, or were accustomed to interpret the Nicene Creed as advancing communication of both personhood and essence, but possibly in a subordinistic way. Besides criticisms from both the Lutherans and Arminians, so Calvin on this question, pretty much the whole church criticized him. So besides criticisms from both the Lutherans and the Arminians, the most vitriolic attacks against Calvin came from theologians in the Roman Catholic Church. Though interestingly, Robert Bellarmine seems to have shown a greater degree of restraint, he called Calvin's Christology orthodox, than other Roman Catholic theologians. In fact, Bellarmine goes to the section in Calvin's Institutes where he's dealing with Gentilis and actually says that Calvin's not denying necessarily the communication of essence. And so Bellarmine was a much more fair reader of Calvin than Lutherans and Arminians, it seems. Now, the Leiden synopsis, commenting upon this, refers to the scurrilous Genebrard, because Gilbertus Genebrardus really went after Calvin, a Roman Catholic theologian, and they give a sort of modest defense of Calvin on this question. And Genebrardus refers to the heresy of the Autotheonites, which he attributes to Calvin and Beza. According to Genebrardus, the Autotheonites say that Christ is God of himself, not of the Father. And he argues that this view leads to a separate principle of deity for the Son and the Spirit and leads to tritheism. So that was the concern, is that if the Son is God of himself and the Father is God of himself and the Spirit is God of himself, do we not have tritheism? And so they went after Calvin's statements, interpreting them in a specific way to accuse him of tritheism. The Leiden synopsis argued that Genebrard's view involved a strong emphasis on the unity of God, the virtual extinction of the distinction between ousia and hypostasis, and allows for a merely rational distinction between the divine essence and the personal modes of subsistence. And so Genebrardus goes so far to the other extreme, trying to get away from tritheism, that he almost obliterates personal distinctions. So with Genebrardus, the English Catholic theologian Lawrence Anderton, writing under the pseudonym John Brearley, criticizes Calvin for preparing the way unto the new Arians. I mean, Calvin was basically called everything. And hopefully this paper will somewhat vindicate Calvin so that his statue can remain standing after this talk. Anderton maintains that while the essence of the Godhead is of itself, yet what the Son hath is not of himself, but from the Father, and is in that respect Deus de Deo, God of God. He adds that Calvin's contrary opinion affirms not only that the Father is God of himself, but that the Son is also God of himself, which amounts to two gods and not one. Thus, Calvin teaches against the Nicene Creed, and this was the charge against him. Now, in the Reformed context of the 16th century, the German theologian Zacharias Ursinus argued that while the Son shares in the same essence as the Father, some have argued that he shies away from the language that he is God of himself, autotheos. And so there's a bit of tension then, some argue, between Ursinus and Calvin. Ursinus recognizes the mystery in speaking this way, but he argues there is a communication of divine essence, whereby only the second person of the deity derives and takes from the first person alone the same essence, whole and entire, which the Father has and retains. Now, the point is this, is that it's not that Ursinus is necessarily responding to Calvin and disagreeing with him. The point is that when Calvin is speaking, he is speaking in a very different context than Ursinus in certain respects. Now, in the 17th century discussion of Calvin's conception of eternal generation, the Roman Catholics continued to criticize him fiercely. In fact, in 1605, the Roman Catholic apologist Matthew Kellison chastised many of his British countrymen, including William Whitaker, for embracing the Nicene phrase, God of God, with respect to the Son, as well as the idea of communication of essence in eternal generation. He argued that Calvin in diverse places avoucheth that Christ is not God of God, as the Nicene Council calls him. And so the best way to critique Calvin by the Roman Catholic theologians was to try and prove that he did not agree with the Nicene Creed. And that's a very powerful polemical tool in public debate. You are not Nicene, therefore you are heterodox, therefore Calvinism or Reformed Orthodoxy is not the way, and Roman Catholicism is. Now, if Calvin had his detractors on this much-vexed question, there is no question that he had his supporters. The Reformed Orthodox theologian and participant at the Westminster Assembly, Francis Chanel, explicitly refers to Genebrardus, who I discussed earlier, for condemning Calvin as guilty of the heresy of autotheism. And Chanel responded by arguing that Calvin did not deny that the Godhead was from all eternity communicated to the Son by the Father. So Chanel's reading is that Calvin is pretty much the same as the majority of the Reformed tradition. In fact, all Calvin wished to do was argue that the Son is one God with his Father, and that the Godhead which is communicated to the Son by generation is an unbegotten Godhead, a self-deity. And so Chanel's defense, which he makes in the context of Calvin's debate with Gentile, seems to be the standard Reformed take on Calvin's intentions, namely that if Calvin appears to be denying essential communication, it's because he's involved in a very specific debate with Gentile. And de Moor, in his own teaching on the Trinity, takes up that line of argument. Now, where Calvin refers to the Father as the fons deitatis, the fountain of divinity, the question is whether it is only in a strictly personal fashion. That's what the whole debate has been about. And as one can see, the Nicene Creed in relation to the Son as autotheos was a theological topic that remained very much alive in England, even at the Westminster Assembly. In fact, Chad Van Dixhoorn, in his judgment, makes the point that the autotheonites at the assembly were not impressed by attempts to create statements that both respected the Nicene Creed and Calvin. So Chanel, arguably the preeminent Trinitarian theologian of the time, is justifying Calvin, but there were some at the assembly who weren't impressed by this. So even at the assembly, they had disagreements, though they respected Calvin, on whether Calvin could be harmonized with Nicaea. If I can just take a brief pause at this point and just say, historical theology is an absolute mess at times when you're trying to figure these things out. It is never say never and never say always. There will always be exceptions, and I just use the word always. Now, at the center of this debate at the Westminster Assembly was a man called Daniel Featley, who published his speeches at the Assembly in a book called Sacra Nemesis. And in this work, he agrees that Christ is theos ek theo, God of God, but that does not mean for him that the deity of the Son is derived from the deity of the Father. True, as a person, the Son is from the Father, but that has respect to personhood and not essence. And so Featley then refers to Calvin's position that Christ is autotheos. He's claiming Calvin on this point. Christ is God of himself, ratione essentiae, but God of God, ratione personae. So in terms of his essence, he is God of himself, but in terms of his person, he is of the Father. And Featley notes the objection made by some that if Christ is God of God, then he must have his essence communicated to him from the Father, and so be essentiated by the Father. And that's the worry, again, is that people are worried that there is a communication of essence whereby somehow there's a subordination. And pretty much most of the Arminians in the 17th century went down a bad path of subordinationism in terms of the Son in their doctrine of the Trinity. Before EFS or ESS, the Arminians were well ahead of those guys in that doctrine. Now, moving along, Featley notes that against this view, Featley does not make the generation of the Son's person coextensive with generation of essence. So many theologians, most in the Reformed tradition, would say that the eternal generation of the Son includes necessarily the communication of essence. He is saying they're not necessarily the same. And so for Featley, communication of essence is best understood as something in common rather than something communicated. In other words, in his view, Calvin firmly rejects any type of language that speaks of communicating or giving essence. And Calvin never wished to speculate. That's why even on eternal generation, it's not very elaborate, his thinking, because he doesn't wish to speculate on how essence can be given. He sees no way in which we can conceptualize this. Now, in a recent essay querying the scholarship of Benjamin Warfield and Brannon Ellis, Richard Muller claims that Calvin's identification of the Father as the principium and fons deitatis almost by itself yields a doctrine of the communication of essence. And so he's saying it's basically implicit in Calvin. Bellarmine even saw this with Calvin and seemed to agree that Calvin was affirming communication of essence, even if it was implicit. And thus, Calvin wants to avoid two errors: a notion of divine quaternity, whereby there's this sort of Father as God, Son as God, Spirit as God, all derived from the fact that there is a divine essence, and so there's four. But he also wants to argue against the idea that the Father alone is divine essence proper, and that the Son is a generated essence or a lesser essence, so Arianism. And so Calvin's treading very carefully between heretics like Servetus, but also others like the Arminians, not even though they were later, but the concepts of the Arminians, to try and come up with a doctrine of the Son in relation to the Trinity that maintains his full and true divinity. So to summarize, as the Leiden synopsis states, I think this is a really important phrase, and this is why the Leiden synopsis is much more careful than Calvin can be, which makes sense. For we assert that if one considers his deity or essence as absolute, the Son of God is rightly called autotheos, as some of the church fathers also called him in that regard. Yet, if you consider the same essence as existing in the Son under a certain and distinct mode of subsistence, then he is God of God, light of light, as defined in the Nicene Creed. So let me put this as simply as I can. If you are simply speaking about the Son of God and you're saying, is he fully God? You can say, yes, he has the independence that belongs to the deity whereby he is God of himself. If you are speaking about the Son of God in relation to the Father and the Spirit, you can also likewise say that the Father has communicated the undividable essence to the Son. And so both are true. So it all depends on how we are speaking about the Son. And arguments from those defending Calvin have insisted that he consistently stated that when the Father and the Son are referenced in their relation, the Son is from the Father. But when Christ, the Word, or the second person of the Trinity, is identified simply and absolutely as God according to essence, he is God ase ipso, God of himself, inasmuch as the divine essence itself is not begotten and exists of itself. At the very least, perhaps we can say that Calvin has a Western view of eternal generation and implies as much without directly stating a communication of essence. So he doesn't get to the point where he's going to be very explicit on this, but it seems to be consistent with his theology. Now, by stating Calvin's position is most true and right, Featley at the Assembly maintains that being a good Nicenist was not incompatible with being a good autotheonite. You can have your cake and eat it. To be sure, the phrase God of God can be understood wrongly, but, argues Featley, so may the whole Scripture. What then? Must we weed up all the flowers of paradise because heretics like spiders suck such juice out of them which they turn into poison? That you will not find in a Crossway book in the bookstore, by the way. I've tried such sentences. The editors always find them. But I think it's an important point that Featley's making, is that anything can be twisted, but that doesn't mean that God of God, because it had been misunderstood by some, whereby the Son has a lesser divinity, that it necessarily needed to be so. In the end, the confession retains the Nicene phrase that the Son is eternally begotten of the Father, but it does avoid the Westminster Confession, referring to Christ as being God of God. This phrase is also missing from the 39 Articles, God of God. Moreover, in contrast to the 39 Articles, the Confession says nothing about the creeds and how they ought to be viewed. However, one interprets the Westminster Confession on the Trinity. Richard Muller appears to be correct in suggesting that Calvin's somewhat radical statements on the Son's aseity is not echoed by all of the early Orthodox Reformed theologians, unless they are understanding him in a highly contextual situation where they clear him of any heresy. Warfield highlights that Calvin's work on this rendered a very great service to Christian theology by insisting that the Son of God was God of himself. So whatever we may say about Calvin and how imprecise he was at times in formulating all of this, he really insisted upon the full and true deity of the Son, and later Reformed theologians were able to conceptualize it a little more clearly, but not in opposition to Calvin. In conclusion, as implications that the Father is the principium of the Godhead, that essence is not generated in a sort of a subordinationist fashion, and that the Son is begotten with the full essence and thus all the attributes of the Godhead, we can move Calvin away from a more radical view on the Son's aseity because of those few statements in his final edition of the Institutes. In fact, his arguments on the Son's aseity are basically confined to the 1559 edition of the Institutes that deals with the heresies of Gentilis and Servetus. In fact, Calvin's two autothean usages were defensive. In fact, the term autotheus appeared in debate with Gentilis largely because Gentilis had used it himself. Calvin didn't even come up with this. If you look at his commentary on John 5:26 or Hebrews 1:3, there's even a lack of discussion upon this point in Calvin where you might expect it. It wasn't meant to be a big deal for Calvin, and yet people have tried to make this a much bigger deal in Calvin's theology when it wasn't even in the earlier editions of his Institutes and only arose because of a highly charged polemical context. Well, what does that tell us then about this whole story? Well, Daniel Featley noted that the exceptions against the matter or doctrine of the creeds either concern the first article, God of God, or the article about the descent into hell. This was indeed the case, and in both points of doctrine, the Genevan Reformer was a major presence, at least in debates at Westminster and throughout the history of post-Reformation orthodoxy, as well as Roman Catholic theologians. In the end, no Reformation figure influenced the proceedings of the Westminster Assembly more than John Calvin, not because his theology was always adopted, but because his significance as a Reformed theologian meant that his views needed to be considered carefully, particularly if they were rejected, because the scriptures were to be followed and not Calvin or the creeds. Calvin would have found this most appropriate, as he writes, "Thus councils would come to have the majesty that is their due. Yet in the meantime, Scripture would stand out in the higher place, with everything subject to its standard. In this way, we willingly embrace and reverence as holy the early councils, such as those of Nicaea, Constantinople, Ephesus, Chalcedon, and the like, which were concerned with refuting errors insofar as they relate to the teachings of the faith."